A grinning Gliscor is a grim sight, gifting opponents grandly grotesque, gruesome grimaces as it sends their entire team to get gradually, graciously ground up by the guillotine. Not in the one-hit KO sense though, but because of its complete mastery over status. Nobody would deny that status conditions are an important part of the game, but still their impact tends to go overlooked, sort of like passive damage. Even when we cross over from in-game to competitive, knowing we have to be more strategic than just mashing one of our Charizard's 4 fire moves, we still tend to think about dishing out as much direct damage as possible, not fully appreciating that status conditions can be just as ruinous, if not more. So today we're diving into why status is close to everything, also known as the Gliscor Theorem. Part 1. The ultimate counter, or why status is close to everything. Status can deal with any Pokemon to varying degrees, potentially ruining them entirely, which makes dishing it out one of the most popular and powerful available strategies. Of the 5 major status conditions, sleep, freeze, paralysis, poison, and burn, there isn't a single one in the bunch you can just brush off. Even ones that don't seem as immediately threatening, like say, a burn Chansey or Blissey, can wind up going quite far. Status's primary strength is that, like passive damage, it affects every Pokemon equally, so long as there's not an immunity, which makes status very easy to spam effectively. Fire Blast might do next to no damage against the quad-resisted Palkia under rain, but a burn wears it down just like it would any non-fire type. It's also not just about status as passive damage. While burn and poison are major in that regard, the 3 other statuses are far more powerful and game-breaking for how they take away the opponent's ability to move. Sleep and freeze are so overwhelmingly powerful, even Game Freak recognized the need to limit them by introducing the sleep and freeze clauses in early official tournaments at Pokemon Stadium, rule sets which were then adopted by singles. The fact sleep was too powerful to allow in the game unchecked is already a warning sign. Smeargle spamming Dark Void freely in VGC 2016 was some real chaos, but even though freeze doesn't have any moves whose sole purpose is to inflict the status, which is unique among the major status conditions, the effect is so powerful it had to be limited. Players turned freeze fishing into a skill, entire teams and battle strategies revolving around volleying as many ice beams at the opponent until something was inflicted with a near one-hit KO given the low defrost rate, or an actual one-hit KO in the Thawless Gen 1. Sleep was effectively a KO in many instances as well, even after its duration was shortened in Gen 3, because sitting around giving your opponent multiple free turns while you try to wake up often results in the best use of your Pokemon being sacrificial fodder. Some players actually argued for a paralysis clause as well. The status doesn't shut opponents down as completely as sleep and freeze, and its primary use is ostensibly slowing opponents down, which means already slow Pokemon theoretically shouldn't care about it, but also unlike sleep and post Gen 1 freeze, paralysis doesn't wear off, and losing a turn 25% of the time can be absolutely devastating when it does pop. You might want to absorb paralysis with your Snorlax that gets outsped by everything anyway, but if it gets fully paralyzed on a critical turn, that's a denied rest on a key turn right there, and there goes your unbreakable wall. Paralysis actually used to be one of the foremost offensive weapons in the earliest gens, when there the power was limited and Pokemon were bulkier overall with the maxed out EV system, but then the later gens realized, hey, why'd we ever stop with that? Turns out gunning for full paralysis is more devastating with higher damage flying around because you likely only need 1 full paralysis. In early gens, 1 or even 2 full paralysis is not going to lose you the game on the spot. If players were able to make 10% Ice Beam freezes work on a consistent basis to the point of regularly chalking up 2 freezes per game when Freeze Clause wasn't active, they went absolutely berserk with fishing for more than double 25% full para rate. And strategies like spamming Substitute with a threat like Superior against a paralyzed Pokemon led to consistently superb results. You didn't even have to fish for it this actively either. Simply paralyzing an opponent gave you pretty solid odds that you'd be able to beat it later on. If you had a hard hitter that an opponent couldn't exactly afford any free turns against, simply getting one would be huge, to say nothing of how common getting more was. But before we talk about effective KOs because of status, if you're a smoker or a vapor, consider replacing those habits with our sponsor, Fume. Look, it's not just about the nicotine that keeps people puffing. It's about the habit, that moment where you just want to fidget or need an oral fixation. This desire for dopamine is what actually causes the habit. Fume replaces that habit with flavored air that has no nicotine, no vapor, and no batteries. It's literally just flavored air out of a sleekly designed tube that you can play around with using your hands. The flavored air comes in a variety of flavors such as cinnamon hearts, spearmint ice, white cranberry, mango, peppermint, grapefruit, raspberry, and black licorice. And every single flavor isn't as strong as a vape, so it doesn't just run through your nostrils and throat. My favorite flavor is peach because I just like the smell of that fruit. Also, the mechanism to adjust how much air is blown is a nice way to quench my desire to fidget. So instead of reaching for your kick, reach for Fume instead. And if you want to support the channel and help us produce more content, you can can click the link in the description below, scan my QR code, or head to tryfume.com and use code FalseSwipeGaming to get a free Fume Topper if you buy a Journey Pack. The idea of Paralysis effectively KOing its targets wasn't just in regard to free turns, of course. Faster threats reliant on their speed had to avoid it at all costs. Defensive Pokemon like Slowbro sometimes dropped super effective coverage against Pokemon they were supposed to answer because Thunder Wave would effectively do so as well, while being far more useful against everything else. Given how effortlessly it could be spread and how permanent its effect, Paralysis became the ultimate form of status as equivalent to a KO, even if it wasn't obvious at first. The effect was peerless for letting Pokemon muscle through counters they'd otherwise have no business beating, especially with how consistently it seemed to happen and how difficult it was to stop. The idea of status as KO didn't just apply to the ones that took away an opponent's ability to move either. Burn and Poison could be just as ruinous. Burn was more obvious in that a physical attacker afflicted by it had its attack cut in half and was thus rendered useless, but the passive damage putting the opponent on a timer meant it was effective against the special attackers often used to try and play around it as well. Even if you had, say, Recover Latios, the fact you'd be forced into healing after a couple turns could be taken advantage of. A different kind of free turn. And it was a major impediment to its ability to take hits. Poison at least didn't impede the afflicted Pokemon's function as directly, but bad poison afflicted by Toxic, the most common kind, sometimes you also see it from 2 layers of Toxic Spikes, was a different kind of ruinous because its constantly increasing damage meant its target was on a timer. Many walls that would otherwise go the distance in long games had to avoid the move at all costs, lest they get stalled out themselves, while even in faster paced games, a Pokemon getting Toxic, like say, an offensive water type like Gyarados, meant the Pokemon it was checking, like our friend Gliscor, simply had to wait it out. In many cases, this meant the game was as good as over. Given the ubiquity of Toxic's distribution and how well it synergized with certain Pokemon whose stabs threatened poison immunities, it was a significant factor in making defensive Pokemon like Heatran as difficult to switch into as they were. Defensive they may be, but Toxic covered pretty much everything, except for Pokemon like Steel types that didn't want to take its Fire Stab. Regular poison just getting free damage was also effective, though it wasn't quite as immediate a KO since it was basically burn without the attack halving, but doing more damage early than the slow build of Toxic meant it was effective in faster paced games, especially because of how it was distributed. The first option was Toxic Spikes, meaning it came from the only entry hazard to deal a status condition, allowing you to potentially afflict multiple Pokemon for one turn of setup, or even if only one Pokemon on the opposing team was affected, it would do so as soon as it switched in. It wasn't like how, say, Tyranitar could simply avoid your attempts to hit it with Toxic. It couldn't escape it. The second option was Sludge Bomb, which meant it was coming while you were attacking, making it a nice bonus, and a common one too, with that high 30% activation rate. Without effective statuses as shutting opposing Pokemon down, it's no wonder so many effective teams across the generations have succeeded primarily with bombarding the opposing team with as much status as possible. It can be a focus on one status in particular. Paralysis spam teams are the most notorious, or you can have a mix. Either way, whatever your opponent has, simply statusing them will go a long way. Whether it's putting one dangerous wall breaker on a Toxic timer that you just have to wait out before the rest of your team can safely wall the rest of theirs, or whether it's paralyzing the opponent's entire team and running over them with a slow, powerful wall breaker of your own. Not that teams need to dedicate themselves to status to reap its benefits. Simply having one Thunder Wave user, for example, can go a long way, even on hyper offense teams that are a stealth rocking lead like Azelf and 5 setup sweepers, where you think there's no room for status. Simply putting Thunder Wave on Azelf can open up a world of opportunity for the rest. Beyond team support, many top Pokemon become notoriously difficult to answer in and of themselves because of status. Sleep has been targeted for bans in numerous generations for how terrifying it is, notably skyrocketing Breloom to superstardom. The aforementioned Toxic spamming Heatran is actually more notorious for spreading burn, whether with Lava Plume or Will-O-Wisp, completely ruining bulky fire resist like Garchomp and Tyranitar. Starting in Gen 5, burn also controversially began to get dished out by water types with super effective stab against fire, the only type immune to burn. Jellicent and the newly half-water Rotom Wash were one thing, with their access to Will-O-Wisp, but nearly every other water in the game also got Scald, the concept of which was taken to its apex in Gen 6 with the addition of Volcanion and its Steam Eruption. Toxapex made a career off of doing things like staying in to eat an Earthquake so it could scald Landorus Therian or Garchomp, even though it did such little damage since the burn was so devastating, while the Toxic and Toxic Spikes it spreads are simply venomous. Avoiding Paralysis pre-Gen 6, where Electrics were buffed to be immune to the status, was notoriously difficult when ground types don't reliably answer Zapdos, which made it even more difficult difficult to take on. Sometimes it doesn't exactly need help with them. Grounds and many others also go from decent answers to utterly useless in the face of Snorlax's para-happy Body Slam, which, like Heatran's Lava Plume or Keldeo's Skull, is so tough to take on because they're not fully committing to the status, they're just trying to deal damage and tend to wind up with the bonus of pressuring their switch-ins even harder as a result. You may have switched that Amoonguss into Keldeo's Skull successfully, but oops, now it's burned, and all Keldeo was trying to do was make sure it hit the opposing Heatran if it stayed in. Actually dealing damage simultaneously with such moves, meaning you have to address two things at once and can't easily stifle them with things like Substitute or Taunt. With all these secondary effects available, status is constantly flying around games even beyond active attempts for it. Yes, Scald and Lava Plume are specifically chosen despite dealing less damage because of their higher burn rate, but most of the time you'll see moves like Fire Blast and Thunderbolt, which nobody is using with any expectation for their secondary effect, yet even when they do kick in, accidentally though it usually is, it's probably going to be one of the most devastating things that could have happened. A first turn Thunderbolt Paralysis is one of the most infuriating occurrences in competitive Pokemon, especially if the full Paralysis kicks in immediately. They're usually far from devastating than crits. Tyranitar can shrug off Fire Blast crits pretty much all day, but if it gets burned, it's toast. We also must mention Confusion, which is not a true status condition since it goes away on switching out, but it's also had its share of notoriety. Unlike Paralysis, it fades in a few turns even if you stay in. But boy, is that whopping 50% to not just not move, but actually damage yourself absolutely horrible to deal with if it's pulled off with any consistency. It's led to nightmares like Swagger and Foul Play, or forget Foul Play, simply using Swagger, especially with priority from Pokemon like Thundurus, to be the ultimate last-ditch counter no matter what you're facing, which led to some seriously disagreeable gameplay in VGC. Singles has been similarly plagued by the status, most notoriously, in Gen 4, Machamp was banned for how much of a literal coin flip its can't-miss, no-guard Dynamic Punch turned the game into, regularly mashing through would-be answers through luck alone, especially since it was so commonly supported by Paralysis. Speaking of doubling up on status alongside Confusion, in Gen 9, Petron's Poison Puppeteer ability, confusing opponents its poison, has also been a source of great frustration, especially with the whopping 50% rate to badly poison the target of its malignant chain. Finally, though it's not even a pseudo-status condition, Knockoff is often used in much of the same way on defensive Pokemon, and goes back to before its Gen 6 buff, simply removing leftovers functions in many cases like Toxic. Now, as strong and often overwhelming as all these statuses are, we also have to consider the alternative. You don't win the game simply by statusing the opponent, so we have to ask, part 2, but status can't counter everything, can it? It's true. While status has been one of the most dominant forces in the game since the first generation, there is such a thing as over-reliance on it. Good players with good teams can feel out a player who's too used to coasting by Toxicking and Thunderwaving everything in sight, and make such strategies look passively ineffectual. It's not an easy task. If simply using things like Lumberry were all it took, status wouldn't be nearly as strong as it is. Teams spamming status generally take advantage of the trade-offs it takes to try and dance around status. For example, using Lumberry or Taunt means you're not using another item or move which might make you more threatening. You might be okay against status, but now you lack the power of Life Orb to break through that wall. Taunt and Substitute block Will-O-Wisp, but they do so at the cost of a crucial coverage move. You have to apply these things carefully. Something like Gen 3 Snorlax can't assuage its Will-O-Wisp weakness with Lumberry because it then loses the leftovers it requires to fight off permanent stand. Not everything is capable of effectively fighting off status. The players that do find a way to do so though can wind up making overt status spam look silly. Using one of Lumberry, Taunt, or Substitute can already go a long way on the right Pokemon. Status is so common that many Settle Sweepers are practically forced to run Lumberry over a power boosting item if they ever want to safely boost in front of anything. But then again, since so many Pokemon run status, this also means they're going to consistently get that free setup. Structure your team to support their lack of extra item power and you're good to go. Alternatively, maybe you wish you could get 2 boosts against 3 status spammers that really put them away, which is why several players had made superb use of combining Lumberry and Taunt or Substitute on Pokemon like Dragonette, Tyranitar, and Gyarados. If you taunted or subbed against the status move immediately, they'll switch and only give you 1 boost. But if you boost on the first status move, then use Taunt or Sub to block the second one, you get a second boost, and at that point, you're going to be pretty scary even without that third coverage move. Suddenly, your over-statusing has provided the opponent multiple turns of setup. These anti-status tactics are pretty heavy on the timing though. You have to be very precise with how you use them, but don't you wish you could repeatedly shrug the status off? Well, refresh is what you're looking for. Not every Pokemon can pull it off, but those that do so to absolutely incredible effect. Many Pokemon are so reliant on their status because of how hard the status is to stop and how powerful the effect is. All you need to do is land it once and you're good to go. But when the right Refresh Pokemon appears, they are rendered utterly useless. Perhaps the quintessential example is Refresh Seismitoad, which thanks to ground typing and water absorb is immune to both Rotom-Wash's stabs, Volt Switch, and Hydro Pump. And with Refresh, it shrugs off Will-O-Wisps as well, making Rotom completely and utterly unable to do anything against it. In a similar vein, if you have a Pokemon with Aromatherapy or Heal Bell, you can really help your teammates out, though they have notably limited distribution. You don't have to actively block or heal off the status either. There are immunities to the statuses. Sleep was the one exception, but then in Gen 6, Grass types became immune to Spore and Sleep Powder. It's not always as easy as having a hard counter to the opponent's status, i.e. use Steel type to counter Toxic, but with good play, you can pivot around them. Especially defensive Heatran, for example, has rather famously been known to absorb many a stalled and even Will-O-Wisp from Rotom Wash. Plus, even if you do have to have a Pokemon take a status, there are plenty of Pokemon that do so just fine. Natural Cure healing the status is effective, as even though you're temporarily affected by the status, you make the Pokemon use the status move again next time you switch into it, which is hugely helpful since, rather than them statusing you once, then proceeding to pile on the pressure with other moves, they have to use the move over and over if they want to make progress. Even if you're not shrugging the status off at all, there are plenty of good options. There are many slow Pokemon that are indeed not too bothered by a potential full paralysis. For instance, a Regenerator Tangrowth can fully paralyze after taking a hit and heal up as it switches out. Regenerator also nicely minimizes the impact of burn and poison. It's far from the only tactic either. Sometimes even less than ideal candidates will eat the status and still manage to impact the battle greatly. For instance, Toxicking a Choice Banded Dragonite isn't going to stop its outrage from leaving some serious damage strewn in its wake. Even burning a physical attacker or paralyzing a fast Pokemon doesn't necessarily automatically shut them down. Still, the ideal response is to be able to ignore the status with immunities outright. Sometimes the Magic Guard Clefable is so prized because not only is it completely unaffected by burn and poison damage, it actually loves being afflicted by them because it means it can't be slept, frozen, or paralyzed. Even in Gen 4, where Magic Guard blocks full paralysis, it would rather be poisoned than suffer the speed drop. Though there, it is of course far better than nearly everything else at absorbing paralysis. So yes, there are plenty of strong tactics against status, but status is still close to everything because it demands these responses, which though they are effective, are still quite limiting. Saying it isn't would be like saying Stealth Rock isn't incredible because Rapid Spin deals with it sometimes. Plus, we still have a third section, which takes it even further. There are those Pokemon for whom status is actually everything, most notoriously including Gliscor itself. It's far from the only one. Not only is it not the only user of Toxic Orb and Poison Heal, it wasn't even the first, having gained it in Generation 5, with Breloom actually debuting the strategy in Gen 4, where the self-statusing Toxic and Flame Orbs were introduced. But Gliscor so thoroughly embodied its ideal, as it continuously dominated OU and even made forays into Ubers, that it has become synonymous with the strategy. Before we get to Gliscor though, we must mention the other Pokemon who are even more fully defined by and reliant on status. There are the other Pokemon that utilize the status orbs. Pokemon like Conkeldurr, Hariyama, Heracross, and Ursaring do so to gain an immediate +1 boost to their attack. Guts means the attack drop from burn doesn't apply, and choosing to take the trade-off of losing their health, though Conkeldurr likes to regain it with a boosted Drain Punch without being locked into a move like they would with Choice Band. They also unlock an incredibly powerful new move, Facade, whose usually paltry 70 base power doubles to 140 when its user is status. It's especially terrifying on Ursaring, who receives Stab on it. There are other abilities that boost their users when status: Marvel Scale, Quick Feet, Tangled Feet, Toxic Boost, and Flare Boost, but Guts is by far the most consistent. Facade's use can go beyond self-statusing Pokemon too, used as an option on physical attackers who are commonly targeted with burns. Mega Salamence and Mega Altaria, whose abilities power up and make Stab Facade, are the strongest examples. And speaking of moves whose viability is entirely tied to status, there's Facade's inverse, the Ghost-type Hex, which doubles in power when used against a status opponent, making it an excellent choice for Ghosts looking to spam Will-O-Wisp. There's also its Hisuian Typhlosion exclusive counterpart, Infernal Parade, which is slightly weaker, but also provides a 30% burn chance, meaning it's basically Hex that skips the need for Wisps and sets the status condition up for itself. Now these are great and everything, but the ultimate ideal remains Gliscor. It was already an excellent Pokemon pre-Poison Heal back in Gen 4, but it was very afraid of status. It had to watch out for Jirachi's Body Slam ruining it with Paralysis. It couldn't afford to take a Toxic, and it definitely couldn't afford to take a burn. So upon gaining Poison Heal, it was able to completely ignore these and fully embody the best of its potential. Whereas Breloom primarily used the Poison Heal ability to dish out its offense, which it was excellent at, being a physical attacker immune to burn and that healed under sand, Gliscor basically got 2 rounds of leftovers recovery. And while it was also a dangerous Swords Dancer you couldn't burn, it was an absolutely incredible wall. The extra healing healing was a major factor, but what really made it so effortlessly good at switching into everything, far more than Breloom, was how it ignored other status conditions and had incredible bulk and typing, meaning it often felt like Gliscor countered basically everything. With a focus on special defense investment, despite not having impressive base special defense, it found itself with a Heatran-esque talent at switching into super effective skulls, completely unafraid of their burn, and even wound up stalling out Rotom Wash's Hydro Pumps after blocking its Will-O-Wisp. Gliscor also wound up being pretty much the perfect switch in the Heatran itself, unafraid of Lava Plume, Will-O-Wisp, or Toxic, and threatening back out with Earthquake, while not even being bothered by Spike's Heatran, and was often paired with and healing off Stealth Rock damage in a single turn. Grass types like Amoonguss, even if they ran Hidden Power Ice, would find themselves walled after Gliscor switched in to stuff their Spore. You could even catch a Rogue Freeze against it with something like an Ice Beam from Clefable or Slowbro, or even an Ice Fang from an opposing Gliscor, all of which Gliscor survived and Roost stalled handily. In return, Gliscor is also tremendous at dishing the status out. As far back as Gen 4, it was the defining user of the classic combination of Toxic and Stab Earthquake, the latter threatening most Toxic immunes, and Taunt allowing it to shut down the Skarmory that could take both. Taunt also means you can't heal it off with moves, not with Rest, not with Refresh, and not Heal Bell. Gliscor only got better at Toxic spamming when it gained so many more switch-in opportunities with Poison Heal. The only drawback was that it did gain another excellent switch-in to the Toxic Earthquake combo, which was of course opposing Gliscor. In addition to Toxic, Gliscor also spams Knockoff to similar effect, right down to opposing Gliscor being one of the few Pokemon capable of taking it. Post-Toxic Orb activation, of course. You have to be cautious to make sure it gets that Poison Heal going, but once it does, Gliscor is the ultimate status machine. It denies yours and dishes out its own. It's one of the most important competitive Pokemon in history, and its status is everything. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Don Creek, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Game Slayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Seagulls Incorporated, Soljiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Tyler, Kiboflu, Wardine, Zathor for their major support of our videos.